When I first encountered Nietzsche's famous proclamation that God is dead, I realized he had merely announced what modern philosophy had been accomplishing for centuries. Yet few understand that this nihilistic outcome was not accidental. It was the inevitable consequence of modern philosophy's foundational errors. The great irony is that ancient philosophers, particularly Plato and Aristotle, had already anticipated and provided remedies for precisely these intellectual diseases that would plague modernity. Today, we witness the full flowering of nihilism in our universities, our politics, and our souls. But this crisis also presents an opportunity to rediscover why the ancients structured their philosophies to avoid the very pitfalls into which modern thought has fallen. The careful reader will find that what appears as philosophical progress is actually a systematic forgetting of ancient wisdom about the human condition and the requirements for a meaningful existence. Chapter 1: The Modern Project's Fatal Assumption. The entire modern philosophical enterprise rests upon a single, catastrophic assumption, that doubt is more fundamental than wonder. When Descartes proclaimed universal doubt as the beginning of philosophy, he unknowingly initiated philosophy's suicide. The ancients understood that philosophy begins not with suspicion of everything we believe, but with wonder at the mysterious orderliness of the cosmos and the peculiar position of human beings within it. This wonder naturally leads to questions about the good, the beautiful, and the just, questions that have determinate answers rooted in the nature of things. Contrast this with the modern approach, which begins by questioning whether anything can be known at all. Having started with systematic doubt, modern philosophy can never recover genuine knowledge of what is truly important. It can achieve technical mastery over material nature, but it loses access to the realm of values and purposes that make human life meaningful. The methodical doubt that Descartes thought would strengthen philosophy actually severed its connection to the permanent questions that give philosophy its dignity and relevance. Consider how this plays out in contemporary academic philosophy. Scholars spend careers questioning whether moral knowledge is possible while remaining strangely uncritical of their assumption that such knowledge is unnecessary for human flourishing. They perfect their techniques of doubt while losing sight of the truths that doubt was meant to clarify. The ancient philosopher began with confidence that the world was intelligible and that human reason could grasp important truths about how we should live. The modern philosopher begins with the assumption that such confidence is naive, never noticing that this very assumption undermines the possibility of philosophy itself. We have gained methodological sophistication while losing substantive wisdom. The tools have become the masters, and the questions that matter most have been relegated to the realm of mere opinion or personal preference. This reversal of priorities explains why modern philosophy, despite its technical achievements, cannot address the spiritual crisis of our time. Having abandoned the quest for wisdom about the highest things, it offers only increasingly refined techniques for analyzing concepts that grow more remote from human concerns with each passing generation. Chapter 2: How the Ancients Protected Philosophy from Nihilism. The ancient philosophers possessed a secret that modernity has forgotten. They understood that certain truths must be approached indirectly to be preserved. Plato did not write treatises announcing that justice is profitable or virtue leads to happiness. Instead, he wrote dialogues that show these truths emerging through careful inquiry, allowing readers to discover them for themselves. This method protects philosophical truth from two dangers: the corrosive effects of premature publicity and the reductive tendency to treat wisdom as mere information. When Aristotle discusses the highest form of human activity in the Nicomachean Ethics, he does not begin with metaphysical assertions about the nature of contemplation. He starts with commonly accepted opinions about happiness and gradually leads his readers to see that genuine happiness must involve the activity that is most characteristic of human nature: rational inquiry into the causes of things. This pedagogical approach ensures that readers arrive at philosophical conclusions through their own reasoning rather than accepting them as dogmas. The esoteric dimension of ancient writing serves another crucial function: it prevents philosophical insights from being weaponized by those who lack the patience for genuine inquiry. The ancients recognized that truths about human nature and political life could be dangerous if misunderstood or applied crudely. By embedding their most important teachings within complex arguments that require careful study, they ensured that only serious students would gain access to potentially destabilizing insights. This protective strategy becomes clear when we examine how Plato treats the question of justice in the Republic. He does not simply assert that justice is intrinsically valuable. Instead, he constructs an elaborate argument that leads readers to discover this truth by thinking through the alternative possibilities. Those who read carelessly might conclude that Plato endorses tyranny or that he believes justice is merely conventional. But careful readers will see that these apparent conclusions are deliberately placed obstacles that test their commitment to following the argument wherever it leads. Modern philosophy, by contrast, seeks maximum clarity and publicity for its conclusions. It assumes that truth benefits from the widest possible dissemination and that methodological transparency guarantees intellectual honesty. But this approach ignores the pedagogical dimension of philosophical communication and the potential dangers of premature exposure to sophisticated arguments. The result is a philosophy that achieves technical precision while losing its capacity to transform those who study it. Chapter 3: The Collapse of Natural Standards. Here I must ask you to examine your own assumptions about moral and political questions. When you hear someone assert that certain practices are simply wrong, or that some ways of life are objectively better than others, what is your immediate reaction? If you feel intellectually uncomfortable with such claims, you have absorbed one of modernity's most destructive teachings, the belief that recognizing diversity among human practices requires abandoning the possibility of judging among them. This represents a fundamental confusion between two distinct intellectual tasks. Recognizing that different societies have different customs is an empirical observation that requires no special philosophical sophistication. But concluding that this diversity proves the impossibility of rational evaluation is a philosophical claim that contradicts both common sense and the evidence of our own experience. We naturally distinguish between better and worse in countless areas of human activity, and this capacity for discrimination is essential to practical wisdom. The ancients understood that human nature provides the permanent standard by which different practices and institutions can be evaluated. Not because human nature is simple or uniform, but precisely because it is complex and multi-layered. Human beings are rational animals who require both individual excellence and political community to flourish. This creates tensions that every society must address, but it also provides criteria for assessing how well different societies address these universal challenges. Modern relativism claims to be more empirically rigorous than ancient natural right doctrine, but it actually involves a dogmatic refusal to consider evidence that might support objective moral conclusions. When anthropologists discover that all known societies make distinctions between justice and injustice, relativists explain this away as evidence of cultural conditioning rather than recognizing it as potential support for the universality of moral experience. The practical consequences of abandoning natural standards are now visible throughout our culture. Without objective criteria for evaluating different ways of life, education becomes mere socialization, politics becomes mere power struggle, and individual choice becomes the only remaining source of legitimacy. But choice divorced from rational standards is arbitrary, and arbitrariness cannot provide the foundation for a meaningful human existence. The crisis deepens when we realize that even the commitment to tolerance and diversity requires some account of why these values are objectively superior to their alternatives. Relativism cannot defend itself without appealing to the very standards it claims do not exist. Chapter 4: Modern Solutions that Deepen the Problem. The modern mind, confronted with the nihilistic implications of its own principles, repeatedly attempts to escape through solutions that only deepen the original difficulty. Consider how contemporary political philosophy responds to the collapse of natural standards. Unable to ground political authority in objective moral truths, it seeks legitimacy through procedural mechanisms, democracy, constitutional protections, and institutional checks and balances. But procedures cannot generate the substantive vision of human flourishing that political life requires. Democratic majorities can choose foolish or unjust policies, constitutions can protect harmful freedoms, and institutions can become instruments of oppression when they are not guided by wisdom about genuine human goods. The procedural approach assumes that we can have good government without addressing the question of what makes life worth living, but this assumption contradicts everything we know about the relationship between personal and political virtue. Modern science offers another false escape route. Faced with the meaninglessness that follows from methodological doubt, contemporary thinkers often suggest that scientific method can provide objective knowledge even if philosophical inquiry cannot. But science, properly understood, is necessarily limited to efficient causation and cannot address questions of final causation or ultimate purpose. It can tell us how things happen but not why they matter or whether they contribute to human flourishing. The attempt to extend scientific method to human affairs leads to the reduction of political and moral questions to technical problems that can be solved through expert knowledge and social engineering. This approach not only fails to address the deepest human concerns but actually obscures them by treating symptoms while ignoring underlying causes. It assumes that human beings are essentially complicated machines rather than rational animals capable of choosing their own purposes. Even more sophisticated modern approaches, such as attempts to ground morality in evolutionary biology or economic efficiency, miss the essential point. These strategies still seek to avoid the philosophical task of thinking through what kinds of activities and relationships are intrinsically valuable for beings like ourselves. They provide external criteria for evaluation while evading the question of whether these criteria themselves are rationally defensible. The pattern repeats itself throughout modern intellectual life. Having abandoned the possibility of wisdom about the highest questions, modernity seeks substitutes that promise certainty without requiring the patient inquiry that genuine knowledge demands. But these substitutes cannot satisfy the human need for comprehensive understanding of our place in the whole. Chapter 5: The Theological Political Problem in Modern Context. I invite you to consider your own relationship to the tension between reason and revelation, for this tension illuminates the deepest sources of modern nihilism. The great medieval philosophers, figures like Maimonides and Aquinas, understood that human beings are pulled in two directions, toward rational inquiry into the nature of things and toward faithful acceptance of authoritative teachings about ultimate reality. Rather than seeing this as a problem to be solved, they recognized it as a permanent feature of the human condition that requires careful management. Modern philosophy attempted to resolve this tension through the decisive victory of reason over revelation. The Enlightenment project promised that rational inquiry could replace religious authority as the source of guidance for both individual and political life. But this apparent victory of reason has produced its own form of authoritarianism, the tyranny of expert opinion and scientific methodology over questions that exceed their competence. When reason claims total sovereignty over human affairs, it inevitably overreaches its natural limits and becomes unreasonable. Contemporary academic culture provides countless examples of this phenomenon. Sophisticated thinkers who apply rigorous logical analysis to narrow technical questions while remaining remarkably naive about the assumptions that guide their own inquiries. They have perfected the tools of rational criticism while losing sight of the larger framework within which these tools acquire their significance. The alternative is not a return to fundamentalism or fideism, but rather a recovery of the ancient understanding that different kinds of questions require different approaches. Theoretical questions about the mathematical structure of nature appropriately receive scientific treatment. Practical questions about how we should live require philosophical reflection that takes seriously both rational argument and the accumulated wisdom of moral tradition. Questions about ultimate meaning may require resources that exceed the capacity of unassisted human reason. This more modest understanding of reason's scope does not lead to skepticism, but rather to intellectual humility and openness to insights that emerge from various sources. It recognizes that the human desire for comprehensive knowledge is legitimate while acknowledging that this desire cannot be fully satisfied through any single methodology. The political implications are profound. A society that recognizes the limits of rational expertise is more likely to preserve space for the kinds of intermediate institutions, families, religious communities, local associations, that transmit practical wisdom across generations and provide alternatives to bureaucratic rationalization of human relationships. Chapter 6: The Prudent Communication of Dangerous Truths. The question that haunts every serious teacher is whether truth is always beneficial for those who hear it. This question becomes particularly acute when we consider truths that might undermine the foundations of political society or personal faith. Should philosophers proclaim insights that could destabilize beneficial illusions? Should teachers share knowledge that their students are not prepared to handle responsibly? The ancients answered these questions through the development of prudent communication strategies that protected both truth and society. They distinguished between teachings appropriate for potential philosophers and those suitable for the general public. This distinction does not reflect contempt for ordinary citizens but rather recognition that different human types require different forms of education and that premature exposure to sophisticated arguments can be more harmful than beneficial. Consider the difference between Plato's public myths in the Republic and his more technical discussions in dialogues like the Parmenides. The myths convey important truths about justice and cosmic order in forms accessible to those who cannot follow complex dialectical arguments. The technical discussions explore the same fundamental questions with a precision that would be incomprehensible to unprepared readers. Both approaches serve legitimate educational purposes, but confusing them leads to either oversimplification of profound issues or needless confusion of students who lack the necessary background. Modern philosophy has largely abandoned this pedagogical wisdom in favor of principles that demand complete transparency and universal accessibility. Contemporary academics often assume that intellectual honesty requires stating all conclusions with maximum directness and that educational democracy means making advanced arguments immediately available to beginning students. But this approach ignores the developmental dimension of learning and the potential dangers of partial understanding. The results are visible throughout our educational system. Students encounter sophisticated critiques of traditional beliefs before they have internalized the practical wisdom these beliefs contain. They learn techniques for deconstructing inherited meanings before they have experienced the human significance of these meanings. They are encouraged to question everything while being given no guidance about which questions are most important or how to pursue them fruitfully. The ancient approach suggests that genuine intellectual freedom requires careful preparation and that teachers have obligations both to truth and to the well-being of their students. This creates tensions that cannot be resolved through simple formulas but must be navigated through practical wisdom that considers the particular circumstances of each educational relationship. The goal is not to protect students from challenging ideas but to ensure that they encounter these ideas in contexts that promote genuine understanding rather than superficial iconoclasm. Chapter 7: The Return to Ancient Wisdom as Contemporary Necessity. The path forward from our current intellectual crisis lies not in new philosophical innovations but in a serious return to the great texts of our tradition. This return must be undertaken with the recognition that these texts contain more wisdom than our current interpretive frameworks allow us to see. The systematic study of ancient political philosophy offers resources for addressing contemporary problems that cannot be found elsewhere because the ancients thought more comprehensively about permanent human questions. Reading Plato's dialogues with proper attention reveals sophisticated analyses of problems that we face in acute form today: the relationship between knowledge and virtue, the tensions between individual excellence and democratic equality, the proper scope of political authority, and the conditions under which human beings can achieve genuine happiness. These are not merely historical curiosities but living inquiries that become more relevant as modern solutions prove inadequate. The practice of slow, careful reading cultivates intellectual virtues that our culture desperately needs. When students learn to follow complex arguments through multiple stages, to notice apparent contradictions that signal deeper teachings, and to distinguish between surface opinions and fundamental principles, they develop capacities for independent thought that resist both popular manipulation and expert authoritarianism. This kind of reading also reveals the inadequacy of contemporary academic specialization. The great ancient texts cannot be properly understood through the methods of any single discipline because they address the whole human being in relation to the comprehensive order of reality. Political philosophy, ethics, metaphysics, and theology are artificially separated in modern universities, but they form an organic unity in ancient thought that reflects the actual structure of human experience. The study of ancients also provides critical perspective on modern assumptions by showing that alternative approaches to fundamental questions are both possible and defensible. This is not a matter of nostalgic romanticism but of intellectual honesty about the contingency of our current beliefs and practices. When we see how thoughtful human beings have approached questions about justice, friendship, and the good life in different ways, we become more alert to the strengths and weaknesses of our own approaches. Most importantly, the return to ancient wisdom can restore confidence in the possibility of philosophical inquiry itself. The ancients demonstrate that rigorous thinking about ultimate questions can yield insights that are both rationally defensible and practically beneficial. They show us what philosophy looks like when it takes seriously its responsibility to provide guidance for human life rather than retreating into technical puzzles that have no bearing on how we should live. This is not a call for uncritical acceptance of ancient conclusions but for engagement with ancient methods and recognition of ancient achievements that surpass anything produced by modern philosophy. Conclusion. The nihilistic consequences of modern philosophy are not accidental but necessary results of its foundational errors. By beginning with doubt rather than wonder, by seeking procedural solutions to substantive problems, and by abandoning the search for natural standards, modernity has created an intellectual culture that cannot address the deepest human needs. The remedy lies in recovering the ancient understanding that philosophy is the quest for wisdom about how human beings should live, both individually and in political community. This recovery requires patience, humility, and willingness to question assumptions that our culture takes for granted. It means recognizing that the technical sophistication of contemporary academic philosophy cannot compensate for its failure to engage seriously with permanent human questions. Most importantly, it means returning to the great texts with confidence that they contain insights we have not yet fully grasped and that these insights remain relevant to our current situation. The choice before us is clear: continue the path toward intellectual and spiritual nihilism, or undertake the difficult but rewarding task of learning from those who thought more deeply about human nature and its requirements than we have yet managed to do.